the sovereignty of God, I want to begin with the phrase, how often is it that we've heard that phrase, God is in control? You know? I mean, when things happen, and sometimes good things happen, God's in control. Sometimes bad things happen, God's in control. But I kind of wanted to go a little bit deeper into this subject about God being in control, because that really does have to do with God's sovereignty. And yet to throw it out there just with a blanket statement, I think you would agree with me that it's not necessarily the answer that we're looking for when we sometimes face the challenges in life. And I did want us to review the first verse or the first of our memory verse in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9. And if you'll read this with me, He has saved us and called us to a holy life, not because of anything we have done, but because of His own purpose and grace. Now, in essence, this speaks to the sovereignty of God, because it says that the reason that He has saved us and the reason He has called us to this holy life is not because of anything we've done, but it's for His own purpose, and it's for His own grace. But when we say God is in control, that can be simple and comforting, but it can also be confusing or difficult to believe whenever life seems to be out of control. And we've all faced crises and situations. Like, what about in a bad situation? Think about a bad situation that happens in your life. And it can become confusing, or like when you lose a job, or you go through an illness, or something tragic happens in your life. And an 18-year-old comes up and says to you, "Oh, well, don't worry about it, God's in control." You know, you just kind of say, "Yeah, right, kid, what do you know?" You know, seriously. But then if a person who has walked with Christ for many years, let's say it's an 80-year-old person, and you've lost your job, and they come up to you, and they put that calloused hand upon yours, and you know something a little bit about their background, that they went through the Depression, and they've gone through the heartache and the tragedy of having lost a house, and perhaps their furniture, and not knowing where their next meal is going to come from. And they pat you on the hand and gently say, "God is in control." Well, that has a whole different context, doesn't it? Has a whole different meaning. So the words can be the same, but depending on who says them and what the circumstance of that conversation is, can make all the difference in the world. Now, the reason I say that is because that's the context of what we find as we look at 2 Timothy. When we talk about 2 Timothy, we look at it in the context that Paul is talking about. God's called us for His purpose. It's His own pleasure. It's His own sovereignty. It's His own will. But He's writing this from a prison cell. He's writing this at the end of His ministry. He's writing this not at the zenith of His ministry. You know, we go back and 7 years before, we look at Paul when everything was going great. You know, a good time for Paul to have said this would have been at the very height of his ministry. You go back and you read in the book of Acts that Paul, once he had that Damascus Road experience, then he went off to Arabia and he studied and he got to know the Word of God. And slowly he was accepted by the church. And as he gave his heart to Jesus, God gave His power back to Paul in such a magnificent way. I mean, there was a place in Paul's ministry where people wanted to be healed by Paul. And there were so many people that wanted to be healed, he couldn't get to them. So what did he do? He took handkerchiefs and aprons. Now, imagine this. I'm going to say this in brutal terms. He took a snot rag and gave it to somebody and they got healed. Think about that. You know, I hope it was a clean one. But whatever it was, they could take the cloth that Paul touched and it brought healing to that person. Now that would have been a good time to talk about how God's in control, wouldn't it? That would have been a good time because everything was going well for Paul's life. There's another example in the book of Acts, and it's one of my favorite examples because Paul's preaching. And for those of you who think that I preach long, how many of you know the story about Eutychus? Well, Paul's preaching one night in the book of Acts, and he goes late into the night And a young man named Eutychus is sitting in the windowsill, and believe it or not, he fell asleep while Paul was preaching. And he fell out of the second-story window. And his name was Eutychus. Eutychus too, if I preached all night, wouldn't you? Well, anyway, he fell out of the window. That's how long Paul preached. Now, rather than, call 911 or have him shuffled off or whatever, Paul stops his sermon, goes down, raises Eutychus from the dead, and then you know what I love about it? It says, Paul went back and finished the sermon and preached again. Imagine that. Think about that the next time I go over time. That would have been a wonderful time for the Apostle Paul to talk about the sovereignty of God, right after raising Eutychus from the dead. But now he's writing to Timothy, his protege. And it's in the second letter also that he acknowledges the fact that he sees the end of his own life at hand. You see, he's chosen to go before Caesar. He recognizes, and it's in the second letter of Timothy that he says, I have finished my race, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith, and my life is like a drink offering and it's being poured out. But Paul's writing from prison. And how easy was it for Paul to write and say that God is in control? God in control sounds good. But when you're going through difficult times, it's not really what we often want to believe or have an easy time believing or really what we want to hear. The fact of the matter is, the Bible never says explicitly that God controls all things. I want you to think about this. Nowhere in the Bible does it say God controls all things. You can go through the Genesis, the Revelation. It doesn't say God controls all things. No matter what we say, there's this evidence of God's references to his power, his presence in all things, but the Bible doesn't neglect the reality that our decisions and our actions and our free will play an important part. And how do they work in the sovereignty of God? Well, actually, what I wanted to do this morning, it's funny, I wanted to find a whiteboard. Do you know how hard it was to find a whiteboard? And I've forgotten how to operate a whiteboard. That's reasonably steady, right? Yeah. Reasonably steady, right? All right. This is a lot of work for just what I wanted to show you here. When we talk about our lives, and we talk about control, and we talk about the sovereignty of God, that's where attention comes in. Because most of us like to think of our lives in this circle. And we want to think that we have everything under control. I mean, seriously. Even when we accept Jesus, we say, well, we made that decision, we've accepted Christ, and we've got things under control. And when we bring them under the submission of the Lordship of Christ, the bad situations, circumstances. But the things that happen, the bad things that happen, like sickness, lost job, bad relationship, marriage ends. Name something else. Depression hits. Think of something else.
Worldwide tragedy.
What's that?
Worldwide tragedy.
What?
Just like 9/11 or something.
9/11, tragedy, okay. Tragedy hits. This looks like it's going to go the other way now. And things get out of our control.
Might as well go ahead and add like easel problems up there.
See you guys on Monday.
Come on, help me, Jesus. There you go. There you go. Just takes that special woman's touch, right? Thank you, Judy. You see, you thought I was in control, didn't you? But see, that's what happens when things go out of control. Loss of a loved one. Okay, loss of a loved one. That's another one. So, when we talk about this whole control thing, it's easy to talk about it when the height of everything is going good. But then these other events happen, and they move outside of that circle. And so what I wanted us to do is to realize that there are certain things that happen that are out of our control. And there are certain experiences that we have that we cannot control. And so what's important when we talk about the sovereignty of God, and we simply say, well, God's in control, we need to realize that any theology that minimizes our own free will and how we respond to the bad situations and says that that doesn't matter is really heresy. If we say God's in control and that's it, and walk away, and don't acknowledge that we have some responsibility in the situation, then that's just playing a game with God. It doesn't work. It doesn't work with God. It doesn't work when you talk to other people. And sometimes, again, other people that are looking at the faith and looking at the Christian faith, they want answers. They want substance. They want to know that if they face a sickness, that you don't just say, well, God's in control and He'll take care of it. But they want to know that God is somehow actively engaged in the process of bringing healing into your life. Or if you've lost a job, and you talk about, well, my God will supply all my needs according to His riches and glory by Christ Jesus. And I find that in the story of the epistle of the Philippians, that was the poorest church in the New Testament when Paul decided to write that. And so we have to understand that there's this place where these bad things happen. It was Jesus Himself who said, in this world you will have what? Tribulation. But then He added, be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. Well, wait a second. In the new millennium, we won't have tribulation. Why can't we just have the new millennium now? Why can't we just have everything perfect now? Because there's a reason that sometimes we're going to face these situations. And the reason is because that's the time that we experience a part of God that we cannot otherwise experience. And this is what I want us to focus on this morning. I want you to think about it. You see, when you hit a tragedy, when you hit sickness, when you hit a lost job, and it's out of your control, you've got to learn to trust. You've got to learn to have faith. All right, Brian, come up here a second. I hope I do better than these.
I hope so too.
He does too. All right. Notice I chose Brian instead of Chris, and you'll understand why in just a second. Chris is the big guy here. Brian's the smaller version of Chris. Big one and easy. Okay. Brian, turn this way. All right. Brian's standing up. He's fine. He's fine. Now, Brian, I want you to kind of stiffen your legs, but I want you to kind of lean back. And continue to lean back, okay? And then, okay? You gave up control, didn't you? Okay, Brian? Continue to lean back. Continue to lean back. Gosh, continue you lean back. All right. Now, if I let him go, he will fall. But if I push him back up, you see, he learned that he could trust, but he had to learn to lean and learn to let go. All right, thank you, brother. That was good. Thanks for not being heavy. Paul, it's easy when the handkerchiefs of aprons are going out to say, oh, God's in control. It's easy when I'm raising the dead or preaching to great crowds to say God's in control. It's another thing when you're in prison. It's another thing when it appears that the mat's been pulled out from under you. And yet, that's the part of our lives that each one of us find ourselves in. And that's the part of our lives that we struggle with this fact that if God's in control and He's got sovereignty in our lives, then where does He come in and where does He fit into the picture? Two scriptures, and this is what I wanted to get us to. What we wanted to do was to look at this through the prism of prison when we talk about God being in control. That Paul's words are significant not because they're written at the peak of his ministry, but from his dying days in a prison cell. And what we realize is we have this circle of control, and yet it doesn't seem to cover the entirety of Paul's life. And so what I wanted us to do is to look at a couple of things. First of all, when anything happens outside of the circle of control, such as that bad medical diagnosis or that marriage ending, that loss of loved one, loss of job, how do we deal with it? How do we deal with it? Well, there's a real simple solution. Real simple solution. And it's almost so simple, you're going to kind of laugh and you're going to think, boy, this doesn't make sense at all, but stick with me on it. When things are outside of our control, you know what you do with this illustration? You draw a second circle. And you call that the sovereignty. S-O-V-E-R-E-I-N-T-Y. The sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God. Because, beloved, you are going to hit those times when things are going to go outside of your circle. And if you understand the sovereignty of God that's based upon the nature and the character of God that doesn't change, that is limitless in His power, and that you can access that part of God outside of your control of God, then you have the secret area, that secret hiding place, where it's the residual of God's power. Now, again, we saw this prefaced in the life of Jesus. When you think about it, again, Jesus, by the way, Jesus had a problem when He preached too long as well. You remember He had 5,000 men, plus the women and children, and they're out in the wilderness. And so He's preaching, and the disciples said, Master, game time. We got to get home. We didn't bring any lunch. Get these people back home. They're getting hungry. And what does Jesus do? He says, you feed them. You feed them. Well, wait a second. We're out of control of this situation. We didn't even bring lunch for ourselves. And you remember what happened? You remember the story. They went out and they found one little boy who had a couple of loaves and a few fish. And Jesus took that and multiplied it. And it was when the disciples passed it out that they became active in the process. But again, it was only when they got into the situation where they had no control that they found the sovereignty and the miraculous nature of God that was the area where they could find peace in that situation. Which again speaks to us when we face trials and tribulation, and when we face situations that we can't control. That's when we look to the sovereignty of God, because God changes not. God is still a good God. He's still in control. If we submit and bring our lives, even the bad things, into His control and into His situation. In Acts 27, 7 years before Paul writes this letter, there's a story in Acts 27, and I think we've got that on the screen as well. Acts 27, we read these words, and again, I apologize, they're a little bit small, so I'm going to read them, but this is from the NIV. I want to give you two examples, and then we'll wrap it up. Acts 27, this is 7 years before Paul even writes this. What we see is a gentle south wind began to blow. They saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. This is when Paul had been arrested. He's being taken to prison to stand before Caesar, not because he's committed any crime as such, but rather because he's been preaching the gospel. He's been doing what God's called him to do. But because he appealed to Caesar, he knew he wanted to make a witness before Caesar, he could have gotten out, but he chose to appeal. And so what is happening is they're taking him back to appear before Caesar, and before very long, a wind of hurricane force, and I think that the King James says Euroclydon. I love that term. But in our vernacular, it's a nor'easter, swept down from the island, and the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. I don't know about you, but I've been in those situations where the storms hit, and we had to give way, and we were driven along. And Paul had had this dialogue with the Roman centurion before they even set sail. He said, you really shouldn't go there. You shouldn't leave at this time. You should wait until the next season, and then there'll be a safe journey. And if you'll just trust me, and they said, no, we want to get this job done. We want to do it in our own time. And so they set sail. Verse 16, as we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard. They passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. They lowered a sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. Have you ever found yourself in that situation? Have you ever found yourself being driven along? It's not a good feeling. It's not a good feeling to be driven along by the wind and by the rage of the storm. But there comes a time when you realize that the greater peril lies in the fact that you've set your sail and you're holding the rudder to the point that it's going to break. And so you have to let the ship sail along and be blown by the wind and be tossed by the waves, because to hold it in one place would certainly break it apart. But again, it comes to that point where you're out of control. It's out of that circle of control that you find yourself so secure in. And Paul himself, here he's on a mission from God. And I don't know about the soldiers. I don't know about all the other prisoners, but I know that Paul has this relationship with God, and he's in a situation where he's on the ship and it is out of control. And that speaks to our lives. You can be serving God and still hit those situations. So we continue here, and it says, we took such a violent battering from the storm. Well, wait a second, you're Paul the Apostle. You're supposed to have the protection of God. He said, we took such a violent battering from the storm. The next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. And I like the fact that this is Luke who's writing the book of Acts. And he says, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. In verse 21, after they had gone a long time without food, we don't know if that was a fast or they were just seasick or what. But after they'd gone a long time without food, Paul stood up and said to them, men, you should have taken my advice. Well, isn't that just a bless you moment from God? I told you so. How to win friends and influence people not. But yet Paul says, he says, you should have taken my advice. You should have sailed in the first place. But then he adds, then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss, but now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. And that's a pretty bold statement. In the midst of the circumstance that appears out of control, in the midst of the very storm itself, Paul stands up and says to a bunch of heathens, well, you don't have to worry. The ship's going to be destroyed, but you're going to be okay. And when he says this, what he's actually doing, he says, you're going to be okay. He's actually drawing the second circle around the situation. He's going on to say this. He adds to this. Did I put this on the screen or not? Here's what he says. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. Now I can put you something on that, but I won't. But the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. The ableness of God is always available to those who serve Him. It's just like the 3 Hebrew children of the fiery furnace. The God we serve is able to deliver us out of your hands, O King Nebuchadnezzar, and He will deliver us. We'll either go through the fire or we'll come out. But either way, God's in control. God is able to do it. Last night, an angel of God, whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. Don't fear. Don't let your fear overcome your faith. You must stand trial before Caesar. God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as He told me. It wasn't based upon the circumstances around him, because they were bad. It wasn't based upon taking a weather forecast, because it wasn't good. It was based upon his relationship with the God of whom he served and of whom he knew the character of God, the faithfulness of God, the relationship factor that no matter what happens, God is still God. And if I bring this situation under His lordship, He will still have control. Next verse. You see what he did? He saw and drew a second circle beyond that circle of control. And it came in the sovereignty of God. The second circle is God's sovereignty. You see, the crux of trusting Christ, this is what I want to wrap up with, is not just asking Him to take control temporarily when life gets out of hand. You see, we play this game with God, to be candid with you. We say, well, Jesus is Lord, and we want Him to be Lord when we're in church on Sunday morning. But boy, Monday morning is a whole different story sometimes. Or when we've lost a job, oh God, we want you to provide a job, and then we get in the job, man, this is a miserable job. And we complain. You see, we often want God to take control when the real answer is God wants to be in control all the time. So it's not a matter of asking Him in the midst of a trial, take control. It's a matter of knowing He's in control all the time. You see the difference? It's living under the sovereignty of God. If you're living under His control, you don't have to ask Him to take control. Does that make sense? So it's based upon that relationship. This is what we believe about our God. That He walks with us, that He talks with us, that we have this relationship. He never leaves us. He never forsakes us. And when we hit those rough times, when we hit the darkness, we need to look to the light. When we hit those rough times and we feel the turmoil, we need to look to the peace of the one who said to the sea, peace, be still, and hush the storm to sleep like a baby. One other example. It's found in 2 Kings, chapter 6, verse 15 and 16. This is another story. This is from the Old Testament. It just shows God covers both bases. In the Old Testament, the prophet Elijah is out there, and he's in one little place, and the enemy comes and surrounds the city that he's in. And it looks like certain destruction and certain turmoil, and his servant panics. His servant comes to him and says, when the servant of the man of God got up and went out early the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. "Oh no, my Lord, what shall we do?" the servant asked. "Don't worry," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Notice that the prophet didn't say, "God, get rid of those enemy soldiers." God just prayed. And the prophet just prayed. And it says, and Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord. Open his eyes, so that he may see." See what? Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses, and in the words of that great movie, chariots of fire, all around Elisha. Beloved, there's one thing that I'll leave you with this morning. If you are facing a trial and you're facing a bad circumstance, think about, is it that God is trying to teach you to trust Him more? Is it that God wants us not to necessarily change the circumstance, but to open our eyes to see the invisible, to see that He sent the armies? Perhaps it's that opportunity to see the miraculous, because if you never had a need for a miracle, you'd never experience one. If you never had a need, you'd never understand the capability of God to meet that need. So, this week, when you're facing a tough situation, I want you to think back to this, and I want you to acknowledge that it's out of control. And let's say let's say you have an unbelieving spouse or something, and you know, you couldn't get them to come to church or whatever, and you know, and you go home. This is kind of what I was picturing in my mind. You know what I want you to do? I'm going to assume that you're a wife here. You've got an unbelieving spouse. You know, while they're sitting there reading the paper, go up behind them. Don't do it in front of them, because it's a little showing off. Go up behind them. You know what I want you to do? Draw a circle around them. Put them under the sovereignty of God. Or, if you're facing a bad, some of you are going to just think about this when you deal with someone at work. You know, how many of you have people that you've had problems with at work? Okay, just go behind them and just put them under the sovereignty of God. Just draw a circle around them. You know, or you get the bill that you couldn't afford to pay. I don't know how this is going to work. But you put that bill on the desk and you draw a big circle around it. And still try to pay the bill. Don't say that it was just a circle on it. I mean, draw the circle around it. But direct your faith on the sovereignty of God. And know that He is still God.